Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we're tackling something seriously fascinating from our source material. We're looking at one of the most intense paradoxes in the history of human organization. It's the brutal, volatile reality of building something completely from scratch versus the easy but incredibly fragile path of just inheriting it. We're going to unpack the core mechanics of how absolute power is actually constructed, right from the ground up.
Think about it for a second. Have you ever wondered why it is that fragile, self-made systems, the ones that face the absolute highest resistance early on, somehow eventually transform into unstoppable, structurally necessary forces? It doesn't matter if you're looking at statecraft, a massive tech startup, or even an insurgent movement, the rule holds true. Early chaos somehow forges the hardest armor. To understand exactly how this works, we need to dive right into the architecture of control.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll be covering the paradox of power, the psychology of control, the 3 phases of survival, how to break the system, modern applications, and finally, the master flaw.
All right, let's dive into part 1, the paradox of power. Our source material today dives deep into Niccolò Machiavelli's 16th century doctrine, specifically Chapter 6 of The Prince, and it contrasts 2 completely different ways to acquire power. On one side, you have power acquired through fortune, or basically relying on the arms of others. It takes very little effort, sure, but it leaves you with incredibly low control stability. But then, on the flip side, we see power won by your own arms, meaning a self-generated force. Now, this comes with extreme risk, but it yields the absolute highest potential for long-term control. The hidden structural principle here is just fascinating. Basically, long-term control is directly proportional to the cost of acquisition. See, when you build your own force, you completely eliminate external leverage points. Because there's no third-party dependency, there's literally no external entity that can control the leader. The military structure's loyalty is fully internalized. It's tied directly to the ruler's survival. And this creates a structural dependency for the population, which ultimately ensures that the authority is entirely self-reinforcing. You get maximum initial resistance, absolutely, but that ultimately buys you maximum autonomy. But that begs the question, how does a leader actually survive that crazy initial resistance?
Which brings us to Section 2, the psychology of control.
The first mechanism we find in the source text is something called the fear compression effect. When a self-made power source enters a new environment, the whole system is super fragile. By applying early, direct force, the ruler rapidly neutralizes population resistance. It's a very clinical calculation. Compressing the resistance through immediate, intense pressure just works far faster and honestly more permanently than trying to gradually institute soft control.
Now, what's really interesting here is human nature. Enter the effort legitimacy bias. People naturally assign higher respect to authority that is gained through visible struggle compared to authority that's just inherited. The very fact that a ruler fought tooth and nail to establish their system actually generates a powerful psychological respect from the conquered population. It's the struggle itself that validates the authority.
And over time, that psychological respect morphs into something far more stable: dependency formation. As the ruler builds out the infrastructure, monopolizing enforcement, creating taxation systems, providing security and basic order, the population actually starts to rely on those exact systems just to live their daily lives. That initial violent resistance naturally decreases and turns into long-term structural compliance. Let's look at how this timeline actually plays out.
Moving on to Section 3, the 3 phases of power.
We can call this the bootstrapped power system model. Phase 1 is acquisition. Direct force is being used, resistance is absolutely sky-high, the system is incredibly fragile, and it's basically pure chaos. It is a total race against time. But if the ruler survives that chaos, we reach Phase 2, consolidation. Things begin to ground themselves, institutions start forming around the ruler, military loyalty stabilizes, and that initial fierce resistance begins to fragment. And finally, we reach Phase 3, normalization. The ruler becomes deeply, securely embedded in the system's architecture. That self-created force, it's now just the default reality of governance. But of course, these systems don't always make it to Phase 3.
So let's talk about Section 4, breaking the system.
If this model is so completely dominant once it's established, how on earth do you defeat it? We're pivoting now from the blueprint of how to build this power to the exact strategic blueprint for destroying it.
To break a bootstrapped regime, you have to act incredibly fast. You must strike during that chaotic Phase 1, before any institutional embedding happens.
You fracture their coercive chain of command early on. You create alternative protection systems for the population so that dependency never gets a chance to form. And above all, you prolong the instability. If a self-made regime's early coercive advantage is neutralized before they can consolidate, the entire system instantly collapses. So why does this 16th century statecraft matter to you today?
That brings us to Section 5, Modern Applications.
Let's lower the stakes a bit from conquering nations and apply this dominant pattern to modern domains. Look at startups scaling from pure founder force to massive market dominance. Or think about cybersecurity. Deploying an internal security architecture gives you high control and low external dependency, but it is incredibly vulnerable during that initial deployment phase before the hardening is complete. In chess, it's that aggressive opening initiative built by player skill. If you maintain it, it's positional domination, but if it's broken early, it's overextension. Even in trading, a high-conviction, independent strategy has to survive those early drawdowns. That's the instability phase, to achieve long-term success. The mechanics of survival are literally identical. However, we really can't accept this doctrine without a ruthless critique.
Which leads us to our final part, Section 6, the Masterflock. It's time to expose the theoretical blind spots in Machiavelli's engine of control. He fundamentally treats force like it's just convertible capital. He assumes fear naturally stabilizes into compliance. But he totally ignores modern information warfare, where digital resistance can persist way after physical coercion is established. He vastly underestimates deep ideological resistance. He assumes the smooth, linear transition from force to stability, completely ignoring the fact that sudden, non-linear collapses happen all the time. And he neglects institutional entropy, the fact that self-built systems require continuous maintenance and governance innovation, or else they just decay.
Furthermore, this entire doctrine suffers from a massive case of survivorship bias. We study the successful founders and the empires that actually stabilized, but the universal rule of the bootstrapped model is that the highest cost of acquisition naturally yields the highest rate of early failure. For every system that reaches normalization, there are countless self-made regimes that collapsed brutally before they ever even reach consolidation.
And yet, for those rare few that do survive the crucible, they achieve the ultimate goal of self-made power. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, incredibly provocative psychological truth. People obey what they cannot imagine existing without. When force transforms into structural necessity, power becomes absolute. Thank you so much for joining me, and I challenge you to look at the systems around you today. Ask yourself, which ones were inherited, and which ones survived the chaos to become totally necessary?